Greetings from the BSC Designer team. In this tutorial, we'll talk about stakeholder analysis and stakeholder management in strategic planning. In the article on our website, we discussed the evolution of reasoning behind the existence of companies. Some argue that business exists only to generate profits for shareholders. Others insist on its social responsibility. While there is no agreement on many questions, what's clear is that the business landscape became more complex, involving more interested parties, the stakeholders. For long-term survival, a company needs to understand its stakeholders and align the needs of stakeholders with its strategy. Who are the stakeholders in the context of strategic planning? We start with typical stakeholders, individuals and groups, but with development of technologies, we also need to consider systems as stakeholders. For example, AI will fit the definition of the stakeholder, and we can think about it as a business system. We can classify stakeholders as internal, like employees, and external, like customers and suppliers. Another way to define the stakeholders is to look at those who affect and those who are affected by our business. For example, investors and communities. Finally, don't forget about regulators and legal obligations that apply. The list of stakeholders might be long. Think, for example, about customers. We can split up this stakeholder into new customers and existing customers, or customers of free plan and customers of business plan, or customers from SMB segment and enterprise segment. The same applies to other stakeholders. Considering a company's limited resources and sometimes contradictory requirement of stakeholders, we cannot satisfy all their needs. We need to prioritize. One of the tools to prioritize stakeholders is the influence interest matrix. We'll manage closely the stakeholders with high influence and high interest. For example, these might be new high profile customers. Some stakeholders have low interest in our company but high influence. For example, regulators. The response strategy for this quadrant is to keep the stakeholders satisfied. In the case of a regulator stakeholder, comply with legal requirements. The stakeholders with high interest but low impact might be the community that is affected by your company. The least thing we can do is to keep these stakeholders informed. Finally, certain types of stakeholders have low interest and low influence. For example, those visitors to your website who were not converted into qualified leads. The response plan in this case is to monitor these stakeholders. We are now equipped for stakeholder analysis and stakeholder management. With the definition of the stakeholders in mind, we start identifying the stakeholders of our company. Having a hierarchy of the stakeholders, we need to prioritize them and list the stakeholders that we will focus on. To finish stakeholder analysis, we formulate the needs of the shortlisted stakeholders. Now it's time to manage the stakeholders. We need to focus the variety of stakeholders' needs on something relevant to our business and formulate it as a strategic ambition. Strategic ambition is still too vague and generalized. To make it more relevant for the strategy of our company, we formulate a high-level goal based on this strategic ambition. We can do several iterations of such decomposition until we get to the level where we understand the stakeholder well enough to quantify the value for the stakeholders. At this stage, the strategic ambition of stakeholders becomes manageable from the viewpoint of strategic planning. we use the value metrics to validate the initial hypothesis about stakeholder ambitions and adjust our strategy. We discussed the theory behind the stakeholder analysis and management. Now let's see how strategic planning software can automate it. Let's create a new scorecard using the stakeholder analysis template. Here we have a hierarchy that corresponds to the types of stakeholders that we discussed. Here is an example of how we can fill in this template. The stakeholder is defined by its name and description. We used the initiatives button to define the strategic ambition of the stakeholder and its priority. We also formulated a high-level goal that we can align with our strategy. Finally, we defined two value metrics for this stakeholder. These details are automatically presented on the Strategy Map tab. Each perspective corresponds to the types of stakeholders, and inside we have the results of the stakeholder analysis. Once the analysis is finished, we can save the results in a separate folder in the My Scorecard section and use it as a reference for strategic planning. On the next step, we can align the results of stakeholder analysis with our strategy. We can connect the value metrics to the metrics used in our strategy scorecards, and we can start developing the identified strategic goals. A final touch. It's a good idea to show what stakeholders stand behind some goal, KPI, or initiative in our strategy. I click Menu, Settings, and switch to the Strategy tab. Here I can add stakeholders to the list of stakeholders in my account. Now we can assign the stakeholders to a goal, KPI, or initiative via the owner field and display them on the KPIs tab or in the reports. Thank you for watching this video. You will find more details about stakeholder analysis and management in the reference section in the description.